If we look at the history of heroes in much of Western storytelling, we quickly notice a pattern. The Greeks and Romans had Odysseus, Perseus, Aeneas, Orpheus, Theseus, Heracles, Jason, and Achilles, just to name a few. Most surviving Norse mythology tales tell the story of Loki, Thor, and Odin. We later have King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table in British lore. Even our modern heroes, at least the ones who make it onto the big screen, are people like Black Panther, Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, Iron Man, Hulk, Hawkeye, Thor, Aquaman, Captain America. So in case that pattern was not obvious, many of the heroes of Western canon are men. When women do show up in their stories, they are often side characters. Even more often, they are love interests or damsels in distress who mostly exist to advance or enhance the narrative of the male protagonist. Lavinia is one such character. As we find out in the course of the book, our title heroine is the second wife and third love of Aeneas, a hero of the Trojan War who fought against the Greeks and is the son of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. As you read through Le Guin's tale of Lavinia, think about the ways this novel differs from the narratives of our traditional heroes, and what similarities it shares with those stories. In her afterword, Le Guin calls Lavinia a translation into a different form, from epic poem to novel. She also calls it the unfolding of a hint about a minor character in the Aeneid. During your reading, consider what Lavinia's viewpoint offers us. Why does her story matter just as much as Aeneas's? And how does it offer us a different take on that traditional storytelling in the Western canon? Knowing a bit more about Le Guin may get you started on the answer to those questions. So join me as I sing of words and the woman who wrote them, a genius author who breathes life into a woman of Latium. Ursula K Le Guin was born in 1929 and died in January of this year, 2018. And Le Guin was born in Berkeley, California, to Alfred Kroeber and Theodora Covell Brown. Her father was an anthropologist and her mother was a writer. And her father was famous for studying the culture of the California Native Americans, and so his work as an anthropologist may have influenced her ability to world build and create cultures in her own work. She had 3 older brothers, and she actually started writing at the age of 5, submitting her first piece around the age of 11 or 12, and it was rejected, unfortunately. The family home in Napa Valley, Kishimish, may also have influenced her work, and we may see some of her love of nature stem from those experiences she had there. Her home was often full of intellectuals and storytelling, an environment that further shaped Le Guin as a writer. And in an interview, Le Guin has said she believed her upbringing lacked sexism because her parents expected the same level of achievement from both her and her brothers. She was also raised in a non-religious household. She studied at Radcliffe College for her undergraduate degree, and then went to Columbia University for her graduate degree. On her way to study in France, she met Charles Le Guin, actually on the boat as they were going over there to study, and the two fell in love and were actually married a few months later in France, and this was in 1953. And she and Charles stayed together until she died, and they have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. After spending time in France, the couple moved to Portland, Oregon, and she and her husband lived there in the same home until she died. So later in her life, Le Guin took an interest in Taoism and actually translated one of the texts from that spiritual practice. And we often consider her a science fiction and fantasy writer, and while much of her work has elements of those genres, they're not really sufficient to truly capture what her work fits into. So one biographer refers to her work as social science fiction because it often addresses contemporary issues in a sci-fi atmosphere or in a fantasy atmosphere. Even though that label is often applied to Le Guin and you usually will find her books under that section, she really kind of transcends genre and fits into more than one box, and kind of resented actually being kept into one box and having her books labeled as just genre fiction. She's very critical of the idea of there being a division between what we call genre literature and literature with a capital L. She really sees those distinctions as limiting. And so genre literature kind of refers to what we often consider popular books, things like detective stories, romances, sci-fi adventures, anything that has its own shelf in the bookstore. Oftentimes, the literary establishment has looked down on genre literature, considering it lesser or low culture, and then saying that things like that we study in the canon, so things that we would study in a college class, stories like the Greek epics, or things written by Charles Dickens or Mark Twain or Emily Dickinson or Zora Neale Hurston, some of those women and people of color are kind of late additions to the literary canon, but we kind of distinguish between popular or genre literature and this what we call the canonical literature. And Ursula K Le Guin kind of did not understand why we drew such distinctions, that those divisions were ultimately harmful. Many of her books focus on the themes of gender, and so a lot of them involve this exploration of gender and gender roles. And we also see a lot of discussion about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, or sometimes aliens in the natural world, but again reflecting that human nature relationship. She was a very prolific writer, and in many different genres. She has poems, novels, essays, and more than 100 short stories to her name. Her works straddle genres ranging from stories for adults to children to young adults. Her most famous works are her Earthsea cycle, which starts with the story of a young wizard coming into his powers and then kind of takes a bunch of different tracks from there, as well as The Left Hand of Darkness, which portrays an androgynous society where the members can switch between male and female throughout their lifetimes, which is something she talks about in the interview with NPR. And Ursula K Le Guin is one of my favorite writers of all time, so if you enjoyed reading Lavinia, I strongly recommend her book The Lathe of Heaven, which is a kind of trippy, exploratory, speculative fiction piece that's written more for adults, and also her book Gifts, which is the first in a trilogy that she wrote more for young adults. And of course, the Wizard of Earthsea books are excellent, and really anything she's written is fabulous and worth your time.